The envelope looked harmless, but inside was the kind of truth that would tear my daughter's world apart. She forgot me on the day I brought her into this world, but I didn't forget what she had done. And when my gift arrived at her door, she finally learned that silence carries a price. My name is Eleanor Hayes. I'm 72 years old. I live alone in a small, quiet house on the edge of town. My days are simple, filled with books, tea, and the sound of birds outside my window. I'm not a bitter woman. I'm patient, observant. I remember the details people think I've forgotten. And that's what makes this story mine to tell. Peace is a fragile thing. It rests on memories, routines, and the quiet belief that family will always be there when the world grows cold. For most of my life, I believed in the small joys of ordinary days. My mornings were steady, tea brewed in the same chipped porcelain cup I'd owned for decades, the newspaper folded neatly on the kitchen table, the quiet hum of the kettle filling the silence of my home. At 72, I didn't crave noise or chaos. I craved peace. And for the most part I had it. The house I live in isn't grand. It's modest, built of old bricks that weathered storms long before I did. The garden out back is my sanctuary, a patch of earth where roses bloom each spring, and where I spend hours trimming, watering, and watching the world move on at its own pace. The oak tree at the corner of the yard has stood taller than me all my life. Its branches a reminder that even with passing seasons, roots matter most. But if the house and garden were my comfort, my daughter was supposed to be my pride. Her name is Caroline. She was the reason I stayed strong when life grew difficult. The reason I endured nights of exhaustion and days of sacrifice. I carried her, raised her, guided her, and poured my soul into shaping her future. Every mother believes her child will one day look back with gratitude. I believed the same. For many years, that seemed true. Caroline was bright, ambitious, and determined. She grew into a woman who demanded attention when she entered a room. I admired that strength, even envied it sometimes. And though distance grew between us as she built her life, I held on to the bond one thought was unbreakable. The bond between a mother and her child. Birthdays became more than just dates on the calendar. They were promises. The day I brought her into this world, I vowed never to forget her worth. And on my own birthday, I thought she would remember mine. That small act, the phone call, the visit, the card, it wasn't about gifts or grand gestures. It was about acknowledgement. A daughter's way of saying, I see you, I value you, you still matter. But slowly things shifted. Calls grew shorter. Visits less frequent. Excuses multiplied. I'm busy, Mom. Work has been crazy. I'll come by next week. Each word was a pinprick, small enough to dismiss, sharp enough to sting. I told myself it was normal. Children grow, they build their own worlds. I repeated it like a prayer. But somewhere deep inside, unease began to stir. Still, I clung to peace. I reminded myself of the quiet joy in my garden, the steady comfort of tea in the mornings, the birdsong that filled my afternoons. These things couldn't abandon me. They couldn't forget me. They simply were. And that steadiness was enough, until it wasn't. Because beneath that quiet surface, a storm was waiting. It began with silence, a silence sharper than words, heavier than absence. A silence that would arrive on a day I thought sacred. My birthday. That was the day I realized peace, no matter how carefully tended, can be broken. And once broken, it never returns the same. Betrayal does not always arrive in a storm. Sometimes, it slips in quietly, wrapped in silence, until the weight of it crushes what you thought could never break. My birthday came on a Tuesday that year. The sky was clear, the air crisp, the kind of morning that feels as though life itself is offering you a gentle gift. I brewed my tea, sat by the window, and waited for the familiar sound. The ring of the phone, the knock at the door, even the ping of a message. Something. Anything. Hours passed. The tea cooled. The newspaper remained folded. And the silence grew louder. At first, I told myself not to be unreasonable. Caroline was busy. She had work, obligations, perhaps even plans she couldn't escape. But as the day stretched on, the excuses I crafted for her began to feel like lies I was telling myself. The clock struck noon, and still there was nothing. Not a word. Not even a simple, "Happy birthday, Mom." It wasn't just the absence of her voice, it was the weight of what that silence meant. After all the years, the sacrifices, the love I had poured into her, she could not spare even a moment. Birthdays are not about numbers. They are about recognition, about the bond between people. And on that day, my daughter's silence told me more than words ever could. I was no longer a priority in her life. But betrayal rarely arrives alone. In the days that followed, I learned more. Through whispers from neighbors, through casual remarks from distant relatives, pieces began to fit together. Caroline had not been too busy that day. She had hosted a dinner party. Photos appeared online, her smiling face, a glass of wine raised high, surrounded by friends. While I sat alone at my table, waiting for a call that never came, she celebrated without a second thought for the woman who gave her life. The sting of neglect became the knife of betrayal. It wasn't only that she had forgotten, it was that she had chosen to forget. She had decided that my birthday, my presence, my place in her world, no longer mattered. And she did it so easily. What hurt most was not the absence of a gift, or the empty day. It was the realization that my daughter, the child I once held against my chest, whose tears I wiped, whose laughter filled my home, had discarded me in her heart long before this birthday. That day was not the beginning of betrayal. It was only the moment I could no longer deny it. I replayed the years in my mind, the times I had sent her money when she struggled, the nights I stayed awake, waiting for her to come home safe, the words of encouragement I gave her when she doubted herself. All of it, erased, forgotten, replaced by a life where I had no place. That was when the silence became unbearable. It wasn't just quiet anymore. It was rejection. It was abandonment. It was betrayal in its purest form. And as I sat in that silence, one truth settled deep within me. The bond between a mother and a daughter is not unbreakable. It can be shattered. And mine had been. But what Caroline did not know was this. Betrayal does not end with silence. It begins there. And in the stillness she left me, I found something she would never expect. Patience. The kind of patience that waits, watches, and remembers. And with patience comes justice. Everyone has a moment when the weight of silence becomes too heavy to carry. For me, it came the day I saw my daughter for who she truly was. In the days after my forgotten birthday, I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than carelessness. People forget. Life distracts. I whispered these things to myself late at night when the loneliness pressed in too close. But the truth has a way of clawing to the surface, no matter how deep you try to bury it. The first crack widened when I visited Caroline unannounced. I told myself I only wanted to see her, to share tea, to sit together the way we used to. But when I knocked, the door opened not to warmth, but to annoyance. Her eyes, sharp and impatient, flicked over me as if I were an unexpected guest, not her mother. "Mom, you should have called," she said flatly. It wasn't the words. It was the tone. Cold, dismissive, as though my presence was a burden she had no interest in carrying. For a moment I stood there, holding the small box of pastries I had baked with shaking hands that morning. She didn't even reach for them. She didn't invite me inside. She stood in the doorway, her body angled as if to block me from entering. I forced a smile. I told her it was fine, that I had only been in the neighborhood. But as I walked back to my car, pastries still clutched against my chest, I knew something had shifted. The breaking point, though, came a week later. A neighbor's daughter, cheerful and thoughtless, showed me photos from Caroline's dinner party, the one held on my birthday. There was my daughter, standing in a sparkling dress, smiling as she cut a cake. The room was filled with laughter, friends raising glasses, the kind of joy that should have been shared with family. My family. There was a cake for her friends to celebrate. But not a word for me. That image burned itself into me. Not because of the party itself, but because it revealed a truth I could no longer deny. Caroline hadn't simply forgotten me. She had chosen not to remember. She had deliberately left me out of her world, a world where I no longer existed. That night, I sat in my kitchen, staring at the pastries I had baked days earlier. They were stale now, untouched, much like me. My hands trembled, not from anger, but from clarity. The bond one thought unbreakable had shattered, And the woman I once believed would care for me in my old age had discarded me like a shadow she no longer wanted trailing behind her. I wept quietly, not for myself, but for the years I had wasted believing love was enough to bind us. I cried for the young woman she once was. The daughter who used to slip her small hand into mine when she was frightened, who used to whisper, "Don't leave me, Mommy." That child was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. Something inside me hardened that night. Not hatred, not rage. Something colder. Resolve. I realized then that silence was no longer an act of surrender. It was a weapon. My daughter had forgotten that I am a woman of patience, of memory, of quiet strength. She believed my age made me weak, my solitude made me powerless. But she had forgotten the most important truth. A mother never forgets. And I would not forget this. The breaking point wasn't the forgotten birthday. It wasn't even the party. It was the moment I understood that I had been erased. And once erased, there are only two choices. To fade quietly, or to carve your presence back into the world with precision. I chose the latter. And my daughter, she never saw it coming. There is a kind of silence that is louder than screams. It doesn't beg. It doesn't plead. It simply waits, patient, unyielding, and sharper than any blade. After the night of my breaking, I didn't confront Caroline. I didn't call her to demand an explanation. Nor did I write letters filled with the ache of a mother's heart. What good would words have done? She had already decided I was no longer worth listening to. Instead, I chose silence. Not the silence of defeat, but the silence of calculation. I withdrew into my quiet routines, the kind that carried me through long years of motherhood. The garden became my refuge once again. I trimmed the roses, pulled weeds, and let the soil stain my hands while my thoughts grew sharper, colder. Silence gave me space to breathe, to think, to understand. Caroline believed my silence meant I had accepted my place in her absence. She mistook my stillness for weakness. That was her greatest mistake. Silence for me was never empty, it was full. Full of memory. Full of patience. Full of plans she could not see. I watched her from a distance. Not directly, but through the threads of life that always connect a mother to her child. Friends would mention her success. Neighbors spoke of the parties she threw, the trips she took, the way she carried herself as though she had no ties binding her to the past. I let them talk. I listened. And I remembered. Each piece of gossip. Each photo that surfaced online. Each careless word Caroline herself let slip when we occasionally crossed paths. They became fragments of a puzzle I was quietly assembling. Meanwhile, I said little. When Caroline did call, her voice brisk and hurried, I answered with calmness that unsettled even me. No accusations. No pleas. Just quiet replies that gave her nothing to cling to. If she thought I was fading, then let her think so. Let her believe I was no threat, no burden. Nothing more than a shadow slipping further away. The truth was, I had learned more in silence than I ever could in confrontation. Silence revealed the hollowness of her words, the carelessness of her actions, the depth of her betrayal. It gave me clarity, a kind of focus I hadn't felt in years. At night, I sat by the window, the lamp casting long shadows across the floor. I would sip my tea slowly, letting the bitterness linger on my tongue. And I would think, not of what I had lost, but of what I still held. Because while Caroline believed she had moved beyond me, she had forgotten the one truth no child should ever forget. A mother always knows more than she shows. And I knew everything. I knew her weaknesses, her vanity, her hunger for approval. I knew the truths she tried to bury, the debts she owed, the secrets she hoped would never surface. She thought time had made me blind. She thought age had made me powerless. But she had no idea that in silence, I had been sharpening the one weapon she could never defend against, knowledge. The silence stretched on for weeks, then months. Outwardly, nothing changed. Caroline lived her glittering life, and I lived my quiet one. But beneath the surface, something was building. A tension, a reckoning. I could feel it in the stillness of my garden, in the hush of the rooms I walked through alone. It was as if the very air held its breath, waiting for the moment when silence would break, not with noise, but with precision. Because silence is not surrender. It is the gathering of strength. And when the time came, my silence would not be empty. It would be the sound of everything my daughter had forgotten, crashing back into her world. Revenge is never rushed. It grows slowly, like roots beneath the soil, unseen but unstoppable. In the months that followed, I became a shadow in my daughter's world, silent, unnoticed, invisible. But while she thought I had faded, I was weaving something she could not see. My plan was not born from rage. Rage burns too quickly. My plan was born from patience, sharpened by silence, and built on truths I had carried for years. Caroline had always been careful about the image she presented to others. To her friends, she was the perfect hostess, glamorous and generous. To colleagues, she was ambitious and unstoppable. To the outside world, she was a success story. But I knew better. Mothers always do. I knew about the credit cards she maxed out to keep her parties alive. I knew about the favors she owed to men who would one day demand repayment. I knew about the debts hidden under the illusion of wealth. Caroline's life was not as flawless as she pretended. It was fragile, built on lies and borrowed time. And lies have a way of unraveling. So I began to collect. Not money, not weapons, but proof. In a small box I kept tucked away in my bedroom drawer, I gathered everything I had. Old letters from her asking for money. Receipts I had saved from the times I bailed her out. Copies of emails she thought I had deleted. And with each piece of paper, I wove a record of who Caroline truly was. Not the daughter she wanted the world to see, but the one she had become. I also spoke quietly with people who had once trusted her. Neighbors she had dismissed, friends she had used, colleagues she had betrayed. They talked more than they realized. People always do, when they think the listener is harmless. I wrote down every word, every detail. Slowly, a picture emerged. My daughter was not just neglectful. She was reckless, arrogant, vulnerable. And still I said nothing. The beauty of patience is that it blinds your enemy. Caroline thought my silence was indifference. She thought my calm meant surrender. She did not notice the way I studied her, the way I traced the cracks in the life she had built. When my birthday came and went without acknowledgement, she had sent me nothing. But I decided then that the next gift exchange between us would not be hers to give. It would be mine. And it would not be wrapped in ribbons or bows. It would be wrapped in truth. The kind of truth that would unravel the life she had built so carefully. I began writing letters. Not to her, not at first, but to the people around her. Letters that revealed debts she owed, favors she had betrayed, lies she had told. I didn't send them yet. I simply prepared them, folded neatly, sealed with care. Each letter was a blade, waiting in silence. And then there was the envelope. One single envelope, plain and unmarked. Inside it, I placed the first piece of truth she could not deny. Something small, but heavy enough to crack the glass of her perfect life. I kept it hidden in my drawer, waiting for the right moment. The plan was simple, but powerful. She would not see it coming. She would not understand it at first. But when the gift arrived at her door, she would know. And the world she had built on lies, on betrayal, on forgetting me, would begin to crumble. Because silence is not weakness. Silence is preparation. And when silence ends, it speaks with the force of everything unsaid. My daughter thought she had erased me. But I was still here. Watching. Waiting. Planning. And soon acting. Revenge is not taken in anger. It is delivered in silence, when the other least expects it. The day came quietly. No storm, no thunder, no warning. Just a soft morning sun, and the usual silence of my empty home. But inside me, there was a calm that only comes when a decision is made and cannot be undone. On the table before me lay the envelope. Plain, white, harmless, at least to anyone who didn't know what it carried. But for Caroline, it would be the beginning of an end. I had chosen her birthday. The irony was not lost on me. The day she expected gifts, flowers, and celebrations would instead bring her the kind of present she would never forget. She had sent me nothing on mine. Now, I was sending her something far more powerful. I slipped the envelope into the post, addressed to her home, with no return name. My handwriting was neat, steady. Years of silence had steadied my hands. When I dropped it into the box, I did not linger. I walked away without looking back, because I knew the arrow had already left the bow. Inside that envelope was the first strike, Copies of unpaid bills, a record of money she had begged from me over the years, and the names of people she had wronged. Names I knew her husband did not know. Names her friends would whisper about once the truth emerged. But that was only the beginning. For days I waited. The silence stretched, taut and sharp. I imagined her face when she opened it. Confusion first, then denial, then fear. I could almost hear her breath catch, her fingers trembling as she unfolded the pages. And then came the phone call. She called me 3 nights later. I let it ring. I watched her name flash across my phone screen, over and over. I did not answer. Silence is its own reply. When the second envelope arrived at her workplace, she couldn't ignore it. This one I had hand-delivered to a trusted acquaintance who worked nearby. Inside were carefully selected truths. The debts she had hidden from her husband, the favors she owed to men who would now be questioned, and a single photograph, her at a party years ago, careless, reckless, with people she had long pretended never to know. Her mask began to crack. Friends stopped calling as often. Her husband's smile grew strained. And Caroline grew restless. She called me again, desperate this time, her voice shaking in the voicemail she left. Mom, please. We need to talk. I don't know what's happening, but please. But there was nothing to talk about. The third strike was the loudest. A package delivered to her doorstep, tied not with ribbon but with a thin black string. Inside was a collection of her own words, letters, messages, emails she thought had vanished. Words she had written to me over the years, begging for money, making promises she never kept. And on top of them all, I placed a single note. You forgot me. But I never forgot you. When she opened that box, her world caved in. I know this because neighbors whispered later of how they found her sitting on the front steps, the box open, her face pale, her hands shaking. The execution was not about violence. It was about truth. And truth, when revealed, is more destructive than any weapon. Each piece I had gathered, each secret I had held in silence, was now in motion. And Caroline could not stop it. Her perfect image, the one she had so carefully built while pushing me into the shadows, was collapsing. For years she thought silence was weakness. Now she was learning silence is a blade, one that cuts the deepest when it finally moves. And I felt no joy, no triumph. Only the steady calm of justice long delayed, finally set in motion. The plan was no longer a plan. It was alive. It was unfolding. And Caroline had no idea just how far I was willing to go. The higher they climb, the harder the silence pulls them down. Caroline had always built her world like a glass house. From the outside, it glittered. Perfect family photos, a spotless home, the appearance of wealth and stability. But glass is fragile. It shatters with the right pressure. And I had applied that pressure one silent strike at a time. The first cracks appeared at her workplace. A colleague forwarded her emails, copies of the same desperate messages she had once sent me, begging for money. In an office where reputation was everything, whispers spread like wildfire. She borrowed from her own mother? She never paid it back? People began to watch her differently, and in those circles, perception is poison. Her boss, a man who prized loyalty above all else, called her into his office. I don't know what was said in that meeting, but I know she came out pale, her eyes red. A week later, she was quietly let go. The second blow landed at home. Her husband, Thomas, had always believed her stories, how I had abandoned her, how I was bitter and jealous. But when the envelope arrived addressed to him, filled with proof of her lies, the ground shifted under her feet. He read her old messages. He saw the debts. He saw the secrets. And then he saw my note, written not to him, but to her. You traded blood for pride. Now pride will trade you nothing. Neighbors whispered that their arguments grew louder at night, the kind that carry through walls, even when windows are closed. He stopped accompanying her to church. He stopped holding her hand in public. And eventually, he stopped staying home at all. The third blow came from her own daughter, my granddaughter. Sweet Emma, old enough now to ask questions, to hear the stories spreading around town. Children talk. Parents talk louder. And soon Emma was coming home with questions no mother wants to answer. Mom, why are people saying you lied to Grandma? Why are they saying you stole? Caroline's face, once flawless in its confidence, began to wear the weight of sleepless nights. Her eyes carried shadows. Her hair, once perfectly styled, now hung loose, unkempt. She withdrew from friends, ashamed of the whispers she could not silence. I never raised my voice. I never showed my hand. But I knew the downfall was in motion because the silence around her grew louder every day. And then came the final crack. She arrived at my door one evening, unannounced. Her figure looked smaller than I remembered, her posture no longer proud but slumped, as if carrying the ruins of her own life on her back. Her eyes, once sharp and dismissive, were wide with fear. "Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please. Stop this. Whatever you're doing, it's destroying me." I looked at her, the daughter who had forgotten me on my birthday, who had treated me as nothing more than a stepping stone in her climb to comfort. I looked at her without anger, without pity, only with the cold calm of someone who has already chosen silence as their weapon. "I'm not doing anything," I replied quietly. "Truth does not need help to destroy. It only needs time." She broke then. Tears, apologies, desperate words poured out of her like water from a cracked jar. Promises to change. Promises to rebuild what she had shattered. But promises from her meant nothing now, because I had seen the truth of her character. And once truth is seen, it cannot be unseen. Caroline left that night, her shoulders heavy, her steps uneven. And I knew, her downfall was complete. She had lost her job. She had lost her husband's trust. She had lost the respect of her child. And worst of all, she had lost the image she worked her whole life to build. Her glass house had shattered. And all I had done was wait. Revenge does not shout. It waits, and then it whispers louder than any scream. I sit here now, months later, in the same quiet house where this all began. The walls haven't changed. The furniture hasn't moved. And yet everything feels different because silence, my oldest companion, has done its work. Caroline no longer calls me. At first, she did, her voice trembling with apologies and excuses, begging me to end what she thought I had started. But there was nothing to end. The truth had already escaped the cage. She tried to keep it in. I didn't need to spread more lies. I didn't need to scream or fight or show the world my anger. I only needed to give people what they ignored for years. The truth. And the truth destroyed her more effectively than any weapon could. Her husband no longer wears his wedding band. I saw him once weeks ago at the grocery store. He walked past me, gave a polite nod, but there was a hollowness in his eyes. A man who had once trusted, now stripped of it forever. I knew then that his trust in Caroline was gone, shattered beyond repair. Her daughter, Emma, has begun visiting me quietly. She comes with small gifts, sometimes just flowers she's picked herself, sometimes a card she's drawn. She asks me stories about the past, about her grandfather, about the family she never really knew. In her presence, I feel the echo of something good. Something Caroline lost but Emma still carries. Innocence. And Caroline herself? The once proud daughter who stood tall in every room now walks in shadows. I've heard whispers. She works small jobs now, trying to piece together money after losing what she once had. Friends avoid her. Neighbors keep their distance. She has become the very thing she once feared. Invisible. I don't rejoice in her downfall. That is not who I am. This was never about joy. Revenge, if you can call it that, was about balance. About showing her that actions have consequences, even when they are buried under years of silence. I think back to that birthday, the one she forgot. The empty mailbox, the silence on the phone, the cruel weight of being erased by the very person you brought into the world. That pain had been sharp, unbearable. But now it feels like a distant scar. The wound has closed, but the lesson remains. Caroline thought silence meant weakness. She believed ignoring me, discarding me, would make me vanish. But silence, in my hands, was not weakness. It was a blade. A weapon she never saw coming. And when the blade cut, it cut clean. I wonder sometimes if she lies awake at night, thinking of me. If she replays the moments when she chose pride over love, selfishness over loyalty. Maybe she does. Maybe she doesn't. But it no longer matters. Because my justice has already arrived. It did not come with fire or fury. It did not come with shouting or storms. It came the way all lasting justice does, quietly, steadily, with patience sharper than any anger. Caroline has learned the hardest truth, that forgetting a parent is not the same as being forgotten. She erased me on my birthday. She thought her silence was power. But silence is mine. And I wielded it in ways she never could. Now I live in peace. My mornings are quiet again, filled with coffee and the sound of birdsong outside my window. My evenings are still, the air carrying no bitterness, only calm. Because revenge, once complete, leaves behind not chaos, but closure. And as for Caroline, my daughter who betrayed me, she walks in the ruins of her own choices. That is her life now. My final word is this. She thought I was gone. But the silence she left me with was the very silence that undid her. In the end, justice did not roar. It whispered. And she never heard it coming. My daughter thought forgetting me was a small thing. But forgetting blood is never small. She believed birthdays were meaningless. Yet mine became the day she lost everything. In the end, silence was the sharpest candle I lit. And when it burned out, only truth remained.